Good evening, humble viewer, and welcome. Find a comfortable position. Perhaps you are settling into a favorite chair or drawing the blankets up as you lie down for the night. Adjust the volume to a gentle level and allow the cares of your day to recede. Let the screen cast a soft glow, or feel free to simply close your eyes and listen. As you begin to unwind, we would be honored if you would leave a comment below, letting us know from where in the world you are tuning in and what time it is for you. It is a quiet comfort to know that as we embark on this journey into the past, we are joined by a community of fellow travelers scattered across the globe, all settling in for a period of calm reflection. Tonight, we are a silent congregation of minds, seeking knowledge, rest, or perhaps a bit of both. Our subject for this evening, and for the sessions to come, is a place of profound darkness, both literal and metaphorical. It is a concept that has haunted the human imagination for centuries, a symbol of ultimate despair and the absolute power of the state over the individual. We are going to explore what it was truly like to be a prisoner in a medieval dungeon. We will not be treading the familiar ground of high fantasy or cinematic drama. There will be no daring escapes with conveniently placed loose stones, no swashbuckling heroes defying their captors with witty retorts. Instead, we will endeavor to peel back the layers of myth and misconception to uncover a far more granular and, in many ways, more harrowing reality. We will approach this topic slowly, methodically, and with the quiet respect that such a somber subject deserves. Our journey begins not with the clang of a closing iron door, but with the world outside that door. For to understand the prisoner, we must first understand the society that imprisoned them. Before the cold stone, before the darkness, before the gnawing hunger and the profound isolation, there was a life lived within the intricate and often contradictory tapestry of medieval society. The path to a dungeon was not a simple one, and it was rarely a swift one. Imprisonment as a primary form of punishment, as we understand it today, was not the standard practice for much of the Middle Ages. The dungeon was, for a very long time, a waiting room, a terrible, brutal and often fatal waiting room. But a waiting room nonetheless. It was a place of holding, a tool used to ensure an accused person would actually appear for their trial, or to coerce a payment of a debt or fine, or to break the will of a political enemy. The sentence itself was typically something far more public and corporeal: a fine, a public shaming in the stocks, a mutilation, or the finality of the gallows. To comprehend the prisoner's plight, we must first immerse ourselves in the medieval conception of law and order. It was a world fundamentally different from our own, built upon a hierarchy believed to be divinely ordained. At the apex was God, and flowing from him was the authority of the monarch, the princes, and the church. Society was a rigid structure of mutual obligations and responsibilities. The three estates, those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the nobility, and those who work, the peasantry and burghers, each had their place. Justice, therefore, was not a uniform concept applied equally to all. It was a reflection of this stratified world. The justice a serf could expect was vastly different from that afforded to a baron, and the justice of a church court bore little resemblance to the proceedings of a secular one. Let us first consider the legal landscape. The medieval period, spanning roughly a millennium from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, was not a monolithic block of time. Its legal systems evolved dramatically. In the early Middle Ages, following the collapse of Roman authority in the West, justice was often a local and tribal affair. The legal codes of Germanic peoples like the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Anglo-Saxons were dominant. These were systems based on custom and tradition rather than abstract legal philosophy. A key concept in this era was the blood feud. If a man was wronged, it was the right and duty of his kin to seek vengeance upon the wrongdoer and his family. It was a cycle of violence that could destabilize entire communities. To counter this, Germanic law developed the concept of the weregild, or man price. This was a system of compensatory payments. Every person, from the king to the lowest churl, had a specific monetary value assigned to them based on their social rank. If you injured or killed someone, you could, in theory, end the feud by paying the appropriate weregild to the victim's family. A nobleman's life was worth vastly more than a peasant's. The loss of an eye had a price, as did a finger, a tooth, or a leg. These early legal codes, such as the laws of Ethelbert of Kent from the early 7th century, are essentially elaborate price lists for human injury. This system reveals a fundamental truth of early medieval justice. It was less about abstract guilt and more about restoring social equilibrium and preventing wider conflict. The primary goal was not to punish the soul, but to mend the tear in the social fabric, often through financial means. In this context, a formal prison was of limited use. If a dispute could be settled with a payment, long-term incarceration served little purpose. Holding cells might be used to secure an individual until their kinsman could gather the funds for the weregild. But the idea of a 5-year sentence for theft was entirely alien. As we move into the High Middle Ages, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the legal landscape began to change profoundly. Two powerful forces were at work: the rediscovery of Roman law and the rise of canon law, the law of the Church. The study of Roman law, particularly the great legal compilation of the Emperor Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was revived in universities like Bologna. This sophisticated, codified system offered rulers a model for a more centralized, state-controlled form of justice. It spoke of public crimes, offenses against the state or the peace, rather than just personal injuries to be settled between families. Kings and emperors saw in Roman law a powerful tool to assert their authority over feudal lords and create a more unified realm. Simultaneously, the Church was developing its own comprehensive legal system. Canon law was not merely concerned with the governance of priests and monasteries. It claimed jurisdiction over a vast array of human activity. Matters of marriage, inheritance, oaths, and usury all fell under the purview of ecclesiastical courts. Furthermore, the Church concerned itself with sins, particularly heresy, which it viewed as the most grievous crime of all. The methodology of the Church courts, particularly the inquisitorial procedure, would have a profound impact on secular justice. Unlike the old Germanic accusatorial system, where a private individual had to make an accusation, the inquisitorial system allowed a judge or inquisitor to actively investigate a crime on his own initiative. He could gather evidence, interrogate witnesses, and question the suspect directly. This shift from a community-based process to a state-driven investigation was a monumental change, and one that required a place to hold suspects while such investigations were carried out. This is where the dungeon begins to find a more permanent role in the machinery of justice. So, we have a complex, overlapping patchwork of legal systems. A peasant who poached a deer from his lord's forest would face the justice of the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward. The laws were local, customary, and swift, with punishments designed to maintain the economic order of the manor. A merchant accused of fraud in a bustling town would be tried in a burgher's court, judged by his peers according to the town's charter. A knight who murdered another knight might be subject to the king's justice in a royal court where the crime was seen as a breach of the king's peace. And a scholar accused of questioning the doctrine of the Trinity would be handed over to the ecclesiastical authorities, facing the intellectual rigor and terrifying power of the Inquisition. For any of these individuals, the first step on the path to the dungeon was the accusation. Let us imagine a man, we will call him Thomas, a simple farmer living in 13th century England. His life is governed by the seasons and the demands of his lord. One day, a neighbor's sheep goes missing. The neighbor, perhaps holding an old grudge against Thomas, publicly accuses him of the theft. In the medieval world, a public accusation carried immense weight. The community itself was a key part of the judicial process. The hue and cry might be raised, where villagers were obligated to stop what they were doing and pursue the accused. There was no professional police force to conduct a careful investigation. The accusation itself was the primary catalyst. Thomas would be apprehended not by a uniformed officer, but by the reeve, a sort of village overseer, or perhaps by the lord's men-at-arms. He would not be read his rights. He would likely be bound with rope and marched to the local place of holding. This would not necessarily be the great, foreboding dungeon of a royal castle. It might be a crude wooden cage, a cellar in the manor house, or a secure room in a gatehouse. The purpose of this initial confinement was simple: to ensure Thomas did not flee before he could be brought to justice. Here, in this initial holding, Thomas would get his first taste of captivity. The immediate shock would be profound. He is pulled from his world of fields, family, and routine, and thrust into a state of total uncertainty. His fate is now entirely in the hands of others. He is likely not given much food or water. Providing for prisoners was not a state expense, but often fell to the prisoner's family or the charity of others. The air would be foul, the light dim. He would be alone with his fear. What will happen to him? The manorial court is not concerned with forensic evidence. They have the word of his accuser. The outcome might depend on his reputation in the village or his ability to find a set number of oath helpers, neighbors willing to swear to his good character. The journey to such a place was an ordeal in itself. A political prisoner would not be walking from a neighboring field. They might be transported across the country, bound on a horse or in a cart, under heavy guard. Every league travelled would be a league further from home, from allies, from any hope of rescue. The prisoner would be a public spectacle, a visible sign of the king's or lord's power to reach out and smite his enemies. Upon arrival at the castle, the prisoner would pass through the layers of its defence, each one a step further from freedom. The outer bailey, bustling with the life of the garrison, the drawbridge over the moat, the grinding of the portcullis as it lowers behind them. They would be led through stone-walled courtyards and up winding staircases into the keep itself, and then they would begin the descent. The most feared dungeons were often located below ground level, in the foundations of the keep. The descent down a narrow, spiraling stone staircase was a powerful psychological transition. With each step, the light from the world above would diminish, replaced by the flickering, greasy light of a torch. The air would grow colder, damper, and heavier, thick with the smell of stagnant water, mold, and human waste. The sounds would change, the ambient noise of the castle muted and replaced by the echoing drip of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, and the prisoner's own ragged breathing. The final destination could take many forms. It was rarely the purpose-built, multi-celled prison block we might imagine. More often, it was an adapted space, a storage cellar no longer in use, a vault in the foundation, or a chamber deep within the massive walls of the tower. One of the most dreaded types of cell was the oubliette, from the French word oublier, to forget. This was typically a narrow shaft, sometimes bottle-shaped, accessible only from a trapdoor in the ceiling. The prisoner would be lowered down on a rope and then simply left. The fall itself could break bones. There was no light, no way out, and food and water were lowered, if at all, at the whim of the jailer. To be cast into an oubliette was to be buried alive. More common, perhaps, was a simple stone-vaulted chamber. Let us place our prisoner here. The heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron straps, is slammed shut. The sound echoes in the small space. The bar is dropped into place on the outside. The torchlight from the corridor is snuffed out, or the jailer walks away, his footsteps receding down the stone passage until there is only silence, and then the darkness. A complete and total absence of light. It was an absolute physical presence. It was the first and most powerful tool of the dungeon. It stripped the prisoner of their primary sense, disorienting them, leaving them to navigate their small world by touch alone. The prisoner's hands might run over the walls. They would be cold, damp, and slimy to the touch. The floor would be uneven stone, or perhaps just packed earth, littered with old, rotten straw that had served generations of previous inhabitants. This straw would be alive with fleas, lice, and other vermin, and soaked with the filth of those who came before. In a corner, there might be a simple bucket for waste, or perhaps nothing at all. The concept of sanitation was utterly absent. The stench would be overwhelming, a constant, unavoidable assault on the senses. It was the smell of decay, of confinement, and of despair. In these first hours, a torrent of thoughts would flood the prisoner's mind. What will happen to me? Will my family be told where I am? Will they bring food? Who are my enemies? Who are my friends? The legal process that brought them here now seems a distant, almost abstract affair. The reality is this: 4 cold walls, an impenetrable door, and a darkness that seems to swallow all sound and hope. The nature of the imprisonment depended heavily on the prisoner's status and wealth. A wealthy merchant or a captured nobleman might be able to pay for easements. They could purchase better food, wine, blankets, even candles to hold the terrible darkness at bay. Their family might be allowed to visit and bring them supplies. For a fee, they might be held in a more comfortable upper prison, perhaps a chamber in a tower with a window, heavily barred, of course, but a window nonetheless, offering a sliver of light and a connection to the outside world. This ability to buy a less horrific experience is a crucial aspect of medieval imprisonment. Justice and comfort were commodities, but for the poor, the friendless, or the political enemy whom the authorities wished to break, there were no such comforts. Their existence was reduced to the barest minimum. The prison allowance, if it existed at all, was often a pittance, barely enough to sustain life. A loaf of coarse bread and a jug of water each day was the standard fare. The quality of this water was often dubious, drawn from the castle well, which could be easily contaminated, leading to dysentery and other fatal illnesses. Starvation was not just a risk, it was an instrument of policy. A weakened prisoner was a compliant prisoner. In these early moments of captivity, the prisoner must confront the new reality of their body. They are no longer a person with agency, but a physical object being stored. The cold seeps into their bones, a deep, unshakable chill that no amount of shivering can ward off. The first pangs of real hunger begin to bite. Thirst dries the mouth and throat. The body, so long taken for granted, becomes the central focus of their existence. Every small pain, every discomfort is magnified in the sensory deprivation of the cell. The silence would be broken by sounds that only served to heighten the terror. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the bailey, a reminder of the world of work and purpose that was now lost to them. The changing of the guard on the castle walls, their shouts and laughter a cruel mockery of the prisoner's isolation. And then there were the closer sounds. The groan of another prisoner in a nearby cell, the squeal of a rat in the straw, the drip, drip, drip of water that could serve as a maddening clock, marking the slow, meaningless passage of time. Time itself would begin to dissolve. Without the sun to mark the day or a candle to measure the hours, the prisoner would become untethered. Was it day or night? Had hours passed or days? This temporal disorientation was a powerful form of psychological torture. The only markers were the jailer's footsteps, the one predictable event in a timeless void. The arrival of that meager ration of bread and water became the central event of the prisoner's existence, the anchor point around which their entire consciousness revolved. This, then, is the initial state of the medieval prisoner. They have been stripped of their freedom, their social standing, their name, and their connection to the world. They have been plunged into a multi-sensory assault of cold, darkness, stench, and noise, or a terrifying silence. They are hungry, thirsty, and alone. Their legal fate remains uncertain, a terrifying question mark hanging in the darkness. They have not yet endured the long months or years of confinement. They have not yet faced the interrogator or the torturer. They have not yet succumbed to the diseases that festered in these places. They have only just arrived. They have just begun their descent into what was, for all intents and purposes, a living tomb, a place designed to break the body, the mind, and the spirit. And in the oppressive silent dark of that first long night, the full weight of their predicament would begin to settle in, a crushing physical force as real as the stone walls that surrounded them. The human mind, for all its fragility, possesses a remarkable and sometimes cruel capacity for adaptation. The initial terror of the dungeon, the absolute darkness, the suffocating silence, the chilling cold cannot maintain its peak intensity forever. It does not disappear, but rather transforms. It evolves from a sharp, piercing shock into a dull, chronic ache, a new and terrible baseline for existence. The prisoner, having survived the first hours and the first day, enters a new phase of their captivity. One defined not by sudden events, but by a monotonous, soul-crushing routine. This period, which could stretch for weeks, months, or even years, was where the true attritional nature of the medieval prison did its most devastating work. It was a time governed by a simple, brutal economy of survival, where the currency was a crust of bread, a sip of water, a flicker of light, and the fleeting mercy of one's captors. The first casualty in this new reality was time itself. As we touched upon, the absence of natural light untethered the prisoner from the universal rhythm of day and night. In the profound blackness of an oubliette or a deep cellar, the very concept of a day ceased to have meaning. The prisoner's world contracted to the space between two events, the jailer's visit and the next jailer's visit. This became the new sunrise and sunset. The interval between these visits was a formless void of consciousness, filled with a mixture of shivering, dozing, anxious listening, and the slow, wandering thoughts of a mind starved of stimulus. The prisoner might try to impose order on this chaos. They might attempt to count their own heartbeats, a task made difficult by fatigue and hunger. They might try to sing songs or recite prayers, the words echoing strangely in the dead air of the cell until their throat was too dry to continue. They might fall into long periods of sleep, though true rest was impossible on the cold, damp floor amidst the vermin. This sleep was less a period of recuperation and more a descent into a different kind of darkness, often populated by feverish dreams of freedom, feasts, or the faces of loved ones, dreams that made the waking reality all the more agonizing. The jailer's arrival was a moment of supreme conflicted importance. The sound of a key in the lock of a bar being lifted was the most significant sound in the prisoner's universe. It brought both hope and dread. Hope for the meager sustenance that might keep them alive for another cycle. Dread for what else the jailer might bring, a summons, a beating, or simply the casual cruelty of a taunt. The jailer, or warden, was not a salaried state employee in the modern sense. He was, in essence, a grim entrepreneur. The position of keeping a jail was often a franchise, purchased or granted by the Lord or the Crown. The jailer's income was derived not from a wage, but from the prisoners themselves. This is a fact of central importance, for it structured the entire experience of confinement. The jailer had a vested financial interest in the prisoners' suffering, or at least in their desperation. Everything had a price. The very chains that bound the prisoner were a source of revenue. Upon entry, a prisoner was often charged a fee for the fitting of his irons. The heavier and more tortuous the irons, the higher the fee might be. Conversely, a prisoner with means could pay for ease of irons, meaning lighter shackles or none at all. This system was known as garnish. It was an institutionalized form of extortion. Do you wish for a bundle of clean straw to lie upon, to lift you from the filth-soaked earth? That would cost you. Do you wish for a candle to grant you a few precious hours of light to see the walls of your cage and perhaps find a less damp corner? That too had its price. Do you wish for your family to be allowed to visit and bring you a pie and some ale? The jailer would require his cut. This monetization of misery created a stark and immediate hierarchy within the prison walls, a mirror of the society outside. A wealthy merchant, a captured knight, or a high-ranking cleric might endure their captivity in a state we would consider harsh, but which was, by the standards of the time, almost luxurious. They could be held in a chamber prison, a room in an upper part of the keep, perhaps with a small barred window letting in light and air. They could pay for a bed, for warm blankets, for firewood, for a hearth in winter. They could have their own food and wine brought in daily. Records from the Tower of London, for example, show high-status prisoners running up considerable expenses for their upkeep, including payments for their servants, who were sometimes allowed to be imprisoned with them. For these individuals, the imprisonment was a matter of confinement and political uncertainty, but not necessarily of immediate physical deprivation. For the vast majority of prisoners, however, the poor, the friendless, the common thief, the debtor whose family had already been ruined, this economy of comfort was entirely out of reach. They were subject to the bare minimum, the so-called prison allowance, which was itself a source of graft for the jailer. Legally, a jailer was often required to provide his prisoners with a certain amount of sustenance, colloquially known as the king's bread. This was typically defined as a small loaf of coarse, dark bread and a pitcher of water per day. The value of this allowance was often fixed by law at, for example, a penny a day. A corrupt jailer could easily profit by providing bread worth less than that, or by diluting the ale if that was provided, or by simply withholding the ration altogether to coerce a non-existent payment. The food itself, when it came, was a study in monotony. Day after day, the same gritty, hard-crusted bread. It was nourishment at its most basic level, enough to prevent immediate starvation, but insufficient to maintain health over the long term. The constant lack of variety and vital nutrients would inevitably lead to malnutrition. Prisoners would suffer from scurvy, their gums bleeding and their teeth loosening. Their skin would become pale and sallow, old wounds would fail to heal properly, and they would become increasingly susceptible to disease. The water was often just as dangerous as the lack of food. Drawn from a castle cistern or well, it could be contaminated with runoff from the latrines or other waste, making it a vector for dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. A prisoner was often faced with a terrible choice: die of thirst or drink the water that could very well kill them with disease. This brings us to the overwhelming issue of sanitation, or rather, the complete lack of it. For most prisoners, the toilet was a bucket in the corner of the cell, which was emptied infrequently, if at all. In communal cells, this single bucket would be used by dozens of men. When it overflowed, the filth would simply spread across the floor, mingling with the already rotten straw. In some more advanced castles, certain cells might be equipped with a guardrobe, a small stone shaft that emptied down the outside of the castle wall or into the moat. While an improvement on the bucket, these chutes were often blocked and foul, and the draught that came up from them in winter was a source of constant, bone-aching cold. This pervasive filth was not merely an assault on the senses, it was a breeding ground. The straw bedding, rarely changed, was a perfect home for fleas, lice, and other biting insects. A prisoner's body would become a landscape of torment, covered in bites that would be scratched raw, often leading to infection. Lice were a particular scourge, not only for the constant itching they caused, but because they were the primary vector for one of the most feared diseases of the dungeon, jail fever. Jail fever, what we would now identify primarily as epidemic typhus, was the great killer of the medieval and early modern prison. It was not a disease of the dungeon itself, but a disease of crowded, unhygienic conditions where body lice could thrive and move from person to person. It would be brought into the prison by a new inmate and would then spread like wildfire. The symptoms were terrifying. It began with a headache and a high fever, followed by a dark, spotted rash. The victim would become delirious, racked with pain, and eventually sink into a stupor or coma. The mortality rate was extremely high. An outbreak of jail fever in a crowded dungeon was a death sentence for a significant portion of its population. There was no concept of quarantine, no understanding of how the disease spread, and certainly no cure. It was often seen as a miasma, a foul air that emanated from the filth itself, or as a judgment from God. The jailer and his staff were also at risk, as were the judges in the courtroom where the unwashed prisoners were brought for trial. A phenomenon known as the Black Assize, where a judicial session would result in the death of judges, jurors, and court officials from the fever brought by the accused. Imagine our prisoner, Thomas, no longer in the initial shock, but months into his confinement. He is no longer the man who was arrested. He is skeletal, his skin stretched taut over his bones. His body is a map of sores and insect bites. He is plagued by a constant hacking cough from the damp air. He has learned to recognize the scuttling sound of the rats in the darkness as they come to investigate any morsel of his meager ration he might have tried to save. The rats were a constant presence, bold and often large. They would gnaw on anything: leather shoes, wooden bowls, and sometimes the prisoners themselves, especially those too weak or sick to defend themselves. Stories abound of prisoners losing fingers or toes to rats as they slept. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. For the prisoner in solitary confinement, the greatest enemy was the self. The mind, desperate for stimulus, would begin to turn inward in dangerous ways. Memories would be replayed over and over until they lost their meaning. The prisoner might have long, detailed conversations with imagined companions, or with God, or with their accusers. Auditory hallucinations were common, hearing whispers, footsteps, or music where there was none. The slow erosion of sanity was as much a part of the punishment as the physical chains. Some prisoners resisted this decay with incredible fortitude. They developed mental exercises, constructed elaborate memory palaces, or focused their entire being on a single burning purpose, such as revenge or the desire to see their family again. Others, however, would succumb to a profound, listless despair known as acedia, a spiritual and mental torpor where they simply gave up, refusing to eat and waiting for death. The experience of a prisoner in a communal cell was different, but not necessarily better. Here, the horror of isolation was replaced by the horror of forced intimacy with the desperate and the dying. A large cellar might be packed with dozens of prisoners, men and women sometimes thrown in together, with no regard for their crime, age, or health. A debtor would be chained next to a murderer, a young boy next to a hardened soldier. This created a brutal Darwinian society in miniature. The strongest and most ruthless would dominate, seizing the best spots away from the dampest walls, stealing food from the weaker inmates, and enforcing a crude and violent order. Yet even in these hellish conditions, sparks of humanity could persist. Prisoners might band together for protection. They might share what little they had. A story, a song, or a prayer shared in the darkness could be a powerful balm against despair. Information could be exchanged, rumors from the outside world brought in by new arrivals, or knowledge of the legal system that might offer a sliver of hope. This society of the damned had its own codes and its own fleeting moments of solidarity, born of a shared and profound suffering. Crucially, this entire system was leaky. The medieval dungeon was not the hermetically sealed fortress of popular imagination. Information, money, and goods flowed in and out, facilitated by the ever-present greed of the jailer. A prisoner's primary hope often lay not in the justice of the courts, but in the ability of their friends and family on the outside to influence their fate. A wife or brother could bring food, bribe the jailer for better conditions, hire a lawyer, or petition a powerful lord on the prisoner's behalf. The alms basket was another vital link to the outside world. Pious citizens would often leave donations of food, money, or clothing for the prisoners as an act of Christian charity. In some towns, prisoners were allowed to beg from their cells, lowering a basket on a rope from a high window to the street below, their voices crying out to passers-by for charity. To be a prisoner without this external support, to be an orphan, a foreigner, or disowned by one's kin, was to be in the most desperate position of all. Thus, the daily life of the prisoner was a state of suspended animation, a grim purgatory. Their body was under constant assault from hunger, cold, disease, and vermin. Their mind was besieged by sensory deprivation, boredom, and fear. Their only connection to the outside world, and their only hope for comfort or survival, was filtered through the corrupt and arbitrary power of the jailer. They were trapped in a system designed not for rehabilitation, but for holding, for breaking, and for profit. Each sunrise they could not see, each meal they did not receive, each night they shivered through, was a testament to their complete and utter powerlessness. They were no longer waiting for a trial in a state of simple confinement. They were being actively, systematically, and deliberately unmade. The medieval dungeon, as we have established, was primarily a place of holding. It was a human warehouse where the accused were stored pending trial, where debtors were squeezed until their families paid, or where political enemies were left to rot. However, for a significant number of prisoners, confinement was not a passive state. It was an active process of investigation. In the evolving legal landscape of the High and Late Middle Ages, particularly with the rise of the inquisitorial system inspired by Roman and canon law, obtaining a confession became the paramount goal of the judicial process. A voluntary confession was considered the queen of proofs, regina probationum, the highest possible form of evidence, rendering all other forms of proof, witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, secondary. This intense focus on the confession transformed the dungeon from a mere holding pen into a laboratory of coercion, a place where the truth, or what passed for it, was to be extracted from the prisoner's body and soul. The process did not always begin with physical violence. The first stage was often psychological. An interrogator, who might be a secular magistrate, a royal official, or, in cases of heresy, a trained inquisitor from the Dominican or Franciscan order, would visit the prisoner in their cell or have them brought to a slightly more formal chamber. This change of scenery was itself a tool. After weeks or months in unchanging darkness and filth, being brought into a room with a table, a chair, and perhaps even a window could be profoundly disorienting. The interrogator, by contrast, was a figure of immense and intimidating power. He was clean, well-fed, and clothed in the robes of his office, be they judicial or ecclesiastical. He held the prisoner's fate in his hands, and his every word, every gesture was freighted with menace. The initial interrogation would be a careful, probing affair. The official would not necessarily begin with accusations. He might ask about the prisoner's life, their family, their faith. This was designed to establish a baseline, to gauge the prisoner's intelligence, their resilience, their weaknesses. The questions would be circular, returning to key points again and again from different angles, designed to catch the prisoner in a contradiction. The interrogator would have a scribe present, meticulously recording every word, every hesitation, every sigh. This written record, the acta, was a crucial part of the new, more bureaucratic form of justice. It created an official narrative of the case, a narrative that the interrogator controlled. For an innocent prisoner, this process was a bewildering nightmare. They would try to answer truthfully, but find their words twisted and reinterpreted. For a guilty prisoner, it was a terrifying cat-and-mouse game, trying to conceal the truth against a trained and patient expert. For any prisoner weakened by weeks of starvation and disease, the mental effort required to follow the circular logic and avoid the verbal traps was immense. The interrogator would use a variety of psychological tactics. He might feign sympathy, offering the prisoner a bit of food or a cup of wine, suggesting that he was their only friend and that a full confession was the only path to mercy. He might then shift abruptly to threats, reminding the prisoner of the pyre that awaited the unrepentant heretic or the gallows that awaited the murderer. He might lie, claiming that an accomplice had already confessed and implicated the prisoner, a classic and often effective technique. The weight of religious authority was a particularly powerful weapon, especially in ecclesiastical courts. The inquisitor was not just a legal official, he was a representative of God. He framed the interrogation not as a question of crime, but of sin and salvation. A confession was not merely an admission of guilt, but a necessary act of penance to save the prisoner's immortal soul. To deny the charge was not just to lie to the court, but to lie to God himself, compounding the original sin with the sin of pride and obstinacy. For a genuinely pious individual, this spiritual pressure could be unbearable. To be told by a priest that their refusal to confess was damning them to an eternity in hell was a threat far more terrifying than any physical torment. If psychological pressure and patient interrogation failed to produce the desired confession, the authorities would resort to the next level of coercion: torture. It is vital to understand the legal and philosophical framework that justified the use of torture. To the modern mind, torture is an abhorrent and unreliable method of gathering information. To the medieval legal scholar, however, it was a regrettable but necessary tool, a last resort to be used under specific circumstances to extract the truth from a recalcitrant suspect. Its use was, in theory, heavily regulated. Roman law, which provided the model, permitted torture in cases of treason, maiestas, and, by the late medieval period, it was increasingly sanctioned in secular courts for other heinous crimes like murder, arson, and counterfeiting. The Inquisition, after initial reluctance, was formally authorized by Pope Innocent IV in his bull ad extirpanda of 1252 to use torture to elicit confessions from suspected heretics. The theory was that torture could only be applied if there was already significant evidence against the suspect, what was called semi-plena probatio, or half-proof. This might be the testimony of one credible eyewitness. 2 were required for full proof, or strong circumstantial evidence. Torture was not meant to be a fishing expedition. It was meant to turn a strong suspicion into a certainty via a confession. Furthermore, a confession obtained under torture was not, in theory, legally valid on its own. The prisoner had to repeat the confession freely afterwards, outside the torture chamber, often the next day. If they recanted, they could, in theory, be subjected to the torture again, as their recantation was seen as proof of their continuing obstinacy. This created a dreadful legal fiction. The prisoner was trapped in a loop where the only escape was to freely confirm the story that had been violently extracted from them. Let us follow our prisoner, Thomas, now accused of a more serious crime, perhaps conspiring against his lord. He has endured the psychological games and maintained his innocence. Now he is told that the court has decided to put him to the question. He would be led from his cell, not to the relatively neutral interrogation room, but to the torture chamber itself. The location of this chamber was often deep within the castle, its walls thick to muffle the screams. The very sight of the room was part of the torment. On display would be the instruments of the trade, a terrifying array of iron, wood, and rope, all designed for the systematic deconstruction of the human body. The torturer, or questioner, was a specialized craftsman of pain, often a grim-faced man of immense physical strength. The magistrate or inquisitor would be present, along with his scribe, to direct the proceedings and record the results. The process would often begin with a final appeal. The prisoner would be shown the instruments and told, in graphic detail, what each one did. This was the last chance to confess and avoid the tormentor. If the prisoner still refused, the procedure would begin, often in escalating stages. One of the most common and widespread forms of torture was the strappado, or corda. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and the rope was slung over a pulley or a beam in the ceiling. They would then be hoisted into the air, dislocating their shoulders with an excruciating tearing of ligaments and muscles. To increase the pain, weights could be attached to their feet. The prisoner would be left hanging, questioned, and then jerked, dropped partway and suddenly stopped, sending waves of agony through their ravaged shoulder joints. Another common method was the rack. This was a large wooden frame with rollers at each end. The prisoner's ankles were fastened to one end and their wrists to the other. A handle or lever was then used to turn the rollers, slowly and inexorably stretching the prisoner's body. The popping of cartilage and the dislocation of joints, first the shoulders and hips, then the knees and elbows, would be audible in the chamber. The pain was absolute, a white-hot, all-consuming fire that obliterated all thought save the desire for it to stop. Torture by water, a method particularly favored by the Spanish Inquisition, was a form of controlled drowning. The prisoner was tied down to a rack or a ladder, their head lower than their feet. A cloth was placed over their mouth and water was poured slowly onto it, forcing them to swallow it to breathe. The cloth would be forced down their throat and jug after jug of water would be poured, creating the sensation of drowning. The stomach would become grotesquely distended and the internal pressure and lack of oxygen created unimaginable agony. Lesser but still horrific tortures targeted specific parts of the body. The boot or leg screw was a device that encased the leg in wood or iron, which was then progressively tightened by driving wedges between the casing and the flesh, crushing the shin bone. Thumb screws performed a similar function on a smaller scale, systematically breaking the bones of the fingers and thumbs. Fire was also used. The prisoner's feet might be greased with lard and held over a brazier of hot coals. Throughout this process, the interrogator would continue his questioning in a calm, almost detached voice. Where did you meet the other conspirators? Who gave you the poison? Confess your heresy. Tell us the names of your accomplices. The goal was not just a simple, yes, I did it. The goal was a detailed, plausible narrative that matched the evidence the court already possessed or suspected. The torturer would apply the pain, then release it slightly to allow the prisoner to speak. If the answer was unsatisfactory, the pain would resume, often more intensely. The human body can only endure so much. Under such duress, many prisoners, innocent and guilty alike, would confess to anything. They would admit to witchcraft, to conspiracy, to murder. They would name accomplices, often implicating innocent friends or neighbors, simply to make the pain stop. The confession was not a product of memory, but of a desperate and agonized imagination, feeding the interrogators the story they so clearly wanted to hear. The scribe would write it all down. The prisoner, broken and sobbing, would finally be cut down from the strappado or released from the rack, their body a wreck of dislocated joints and torn muscles. They would be carried back to their cell and left in the filth to recover if they could. The physical aftermath was brutal. Without medical attention, which was rarely provided, dislocated limbs would heal improperly, leaving the prisoner crippled for life. Crushed bones would lead to chronic pain. The psychological trauma was even deeper. The prisoner had been systematically unmade, their will broken, their body turned against them. They had betrayed themselves, and perhaps others. The next day, or a few days later, they would be brought before the interrogator again. Their confession, now neatly written out by the scribe, would be read back to them. They would be asked, in the absence of torture, to confirm its truth. For many, the memory of the agony and the implicit threat that it could be repeated was more than enough. They would sign their name or make their mark, sealing their own fate. This was the moment the legal fiction was completed. The forced confession was laundered into a voluntary one. For those who possessed almost superhuman endurance and refused to confess even under the most extreme torment, the outcome was paradoxical. In some legal traditions, surviving the torture without confessing was considered a sign of innocence, another form of ordeal, a proof that God had given them the strength to resist. They were, in theory, to be set free. However, this was rare. A magistrate who had gone to the trouble of ordering torture was often convinced of the prisoner's guilt and might find other ways to secure a conviction, or simply leave the prisoner to languish in the dungeon indefinitely, a practice known as penitential imprisonment, particularly in church courts where the aim was the conversion of the heretic, no matter how long it took. The spectre of torture hung over every prisoner accused of a serious crime. The threat of it was often as effective as the application. The stories and screams that leaked from the dungeon's depths served as a powerful deterrent and a terrifying reminder of the state's ultimate power. It was a system that privileged confession above all else, and in doing so, created a terrifying machine for the production of guilt. For the prisoner trapped within it, the law was not a shield or a process for discovering truth. It was a labyrinth of psychological traps and physical horrors, where the only exit led to a preordained conclusion, written not by the facts of the case, but by the prisoner's own capacity to endure unimaginable pain. This was the dark heart of the medieval judicial process, a place where the human body itself became the final, agonized piece of evidence. While for many the dungeon was a terrifying antechamber to the courtroom, the gallows or the stake, for others it became a near-permanent home, a state of being that stretched into a desolate horizon. The reasons for such long-term incarceration were varied, reflecting the complex and often contradictory priorities of medieval society. The very concept of imprisonment as a sentence in itself, rather than a temporary measure, was a slow-growing vine in the garden of medieval jurisprudence. The dominant forms of punishment were public, corporal, and spectacular. A hanging was a communal event, a branding a permanent lesson etched in flesh, a fine a swift rebalancing of social accounts. These were punishments of action. Long-term imprisonment was a punishment of stasis, a slow, quiet, and private grinding down of the individual, hidden away from the public gaze. It was, in many ways, a more modern form of cruelty, cloaked in the stone and shadow of the old world. To truly understand this chapter of dungeon life, we must dissect the different forms this stasis took. The long-term prisoners were not a homogeneous group. Their experiences, their prospects, and their psychological landscapes differed as profoundly as those of a king and a pauper in the world outside. Their fates were dictated not just by their alleged crime, but by their wealth, their name, and their connections. We will examine three distinct archetypes, three separate paths into the long night of indefinite captivity: the debtor, whose freedom was a commodity to be bought and sold; the political prisoner, whose body was a pawn in the lethal game of power; and the most tragic of all, the forgotten, those who slipped through the cracks of an indifferent judicial system and were left to languish in a pit of meaninglessness. Let us first consider the debtor. In a world without formalized bankruptcy laws as we know them, and with a rapidly expanding commercial economy in the high and late Middle Ages, the extension of credit was the lifeblood of commerce, and the reality of debt was a constant and perilous feature of life. A peasant could fall into debt to his lord over a failed crop or the cost of a new plough. A skilled artisan might borrow to purchase raw materials. A merchant could be ruined by a single lost shipment to piracy or storm. Even the highest nobility were perpetually engaged in a dance with debt, financing lavish lifestyles, costly wars, and political ambitions through loans from wealthy burghers, banking families, or Jewish moneylenders. When a debt could not be paid, The creditor had a powerful and terrifyingly effective legal remedy. They could, through a court order, have the debtor physically seized and imprisoned. This form of imprisonment was fundamentally different from that of a common criminal. The debtor was not, in the eyes of the law, being punished for a moral failing or a crime against the king's peace. Rather, the dungeon was being employed as a tool of private, commercial coercion. It was a thumbscrew applied not just to the individual, but to their entire social and familial network. The logic was simple, unsentimental, and brutal. A man locked in a dungeon cannot work his fields, run his shop, or command his men. His business will wither, his reputation will be shredded, and his family will face the dual burdens of shame and destitution. Therefore, to secure his release and salvage what remains of their collective fortune and honor, his kinsmen, his wife, his business partners, or his guild would be forced to scrape together the necessary funds to satisfy the creditor. The process began in a court. The creditor would present evidence of the loan, a signed contract, a tally stick, or witness testimony, and if the court found in his favor, it would issue a writ. This document empowered the local law officer, the sheriff or reeve, to seize the body of the debtor and deliver them to the designated prison until the debt was settled. The prison itself, whether a royal castle dungeon or a town jail, did not profit directly from the repayment of the debt. Its interest was more immediate. The jailer, our grim entrepreneur, viewed the debtor as a steady source of income. The creditor was often legally obligated to pay a pittance for the prisoner's barest survival, the daily loaf and water. But anything beyond this, and survival often depended on what was beyond this, was up to the debtor to procure. Imagine a once proud wool merchant, we shall call him Walter, whose fortunes have turned. A shipment of his finest fleece was lost at sea, and he has defaulted on a loan to a powerful moneylender. He is arrested in his own home, in front of his wife and children, and marched through the streets of the town where he was once a respected figure. He is brought to the town jail, a damp and crowded place. Here, the stark reality of the prison economy immediately confronts him. He is charged a fee for his own imprisonment, a fee for the irons placed on his ankles, and offered garnish, the opportunity to pay for a less squalid existence. The debtors' prison, or the section of a larger prison reserved for debtors, quickly evolved its own peculiar and rigidly stratified society. For those like Walter, who might still have some access to funds through a loyal wife or brother, life could be made tolerable, if humiliating. They could pay for a place on the master's side, a section of the prison with private or semi-private rooms, perhaps even one with a small barred window. They could purchase cleaner straw, blankets, candles, and better food from the jailer's own tavern. They could pay for the privilege of receiving visitors, for the use of pen and ink to write frantic letters pleading for help, trying to manage the collapse of their business from afar. For this class of debtor, prison was a purgatory of intense anxiety and financial calculation, a race against time to raise the funds for their release before their assets on the outside evaporated completely. But for the debtor from a modest background, the baker who could not pay his flour bill, the farmer whose crops failed 2 seasons in a row, the situation was a direct descent into hell. They were cast into the common ward, the hole or the 2-penny ward, a squalid subterranean space where they were thrown in with the general population of felons, murderers, and the insane. Here, there was no master's side. There was only the cold, filth-soaked floor. Their families, already poor, had nothing to send. Their creditor had no incentive to release them without payment. They were truly trapped. The psychological state of the debtor was one of profound and agitated frustration. Unlike the accused criminal who awaited a trial that would bring a final resolution, the debtor's sentence was indefinite, a foggy horizon of hope and despair. Their freedom was a line item on a balance sheet somewhere in the outside world. They would listen for the jailer's steps, not with the simple dread of a felon, but with the desperate hope that he brought news, a message from their wife, a proposal from their creditor. Every day that passed in silence was a victory for their slow ruination. They would lie awake in the dark, not contemplating their sins, but running endless, agonizing calculations in their head. How much was the loom worth? Could their brother sell the ox? The shame was a constant companion. The thought of their children going hungry, a far greater torment than the gnawing of their own stomach. They had failed in their primary duty as a provider, and the stone walls were a constant physical reminder of that failure. Many would not survive. Utterly dependent on the alms basket or the charity of strangers, they were the first to succumb to the ravages of jail fever and malnutrition. Their bodies, weakened by hunger and despair, had no defense. They would die in the squalor of the common ward, their debt effectively becoming a death sentence, their passing noted only as a minor inconvenience for the jailer who had to have the body removed. Others might languish for decades, becoming institutionalized, their hopes slowly calcifying into a kind of dull resignation. They might only be released when their creditor finally died, and the creditor's heirs, sorting through his affairs, decided that the small, lingering debt was not worth the continued expense of the prison allowance. They would be turned out into the street, old, broken, without family or prospects, a ghost of a man whose life had been consumed by a few forgotten coins. The debtor's tale is a stark reminder that in the medieval world, justice was often an extension of commerce, and a man's life could be worth less than the paper on which his debt was recorded. Now let us turn to a prisoner of a very different stature and circumstance, the political captive. This individual was not a common criminal or a failed merchant, but a high-value piece on the great chessboard of feudal politics. They were a captured enemy knight from a foreign war, a rebellious baron who had picked the losing side in a civil conflict, a rival claimant to a throne, or even a member of the royal family, a brother or cousin whose very existence was a latent threat to the reigning monarch. For these high-status prisoners, the physical conditions of their confinement were often incomparably better than those of the common inmate, but their psychological burden was unique, subtle, and immense. The political prisoner's body was a valuable state asset. To their captor, they represented leverage, wealth, and security. A captured French knight during the 100 Years' War could be ransomed for a sum that could finance a whole season of campaigning. A rebellious northern earl, held securely in the Tower of London, was a guarantee of his vassals' and family's good behaviour. To kill such a prisoner was often to throw away a valuable diplomatic or financial card. Consequently, they were generally kept alive and in a state of reasonable health, their value carefully preserved. Their prison was not the subterranean oubliette. They were typically held in the upper chambers of a royal castle's keep or a major tower, the chamber prison we have previously mentioned. This might be a relatively spacious room, perhaps with timber-panelled walls, a fireplace to ward off the chill, and a proper bed with furs and woolen blankets. Most importantly, it would likely have a window. This window, though heavily barred, was a crucial distinction. It allowed in light and air, and it provided a connection, however tenuous, to the outside world. The prisoner could watch the changing of the seasons, see the movement of ships on the river, and hear the sounds of the living world. The account books of major state prisons like the Tower of London or the Conciergerie in Paris provide a fascinating glimpse into this world of privileged captivity. They meticulously record payments for fine food, venison, salmon, and fowl, and for barrels of wine and ale. They list expenditures for new clothes of fine cloth, for the services of physicians and barbers, and for the fuel to keep their chambers warm. High-ranking prisoners were often allowed to keep a small retinue of their own servants, who would be imprisoned with them to see to their daily needs. They might have access to books, the Bible, chivalric romances, or, most fittingly, Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, a work written by a high-ranking Roman official during his own imprisonment and eventual execution. They might be allowed to receive carefully vetted visitors, to send and receive censored letters, and even, on occasion, to take escorted walks along the castle ramparts for exercise. King John I of France, captured by the English at Poitiers, lived a life of such comfortable captivity that he was able to host feasts and go hunting, a bizarre parody of his former royal life, all while the colossal sum for his ransom was being negotiated. However, this relative physical comfort, this gilded cage, masked a profound and corrosive psychological torment. The political prisoner was adrift in a sea of absolute uncertainty, their fate dictated by the great, slow-grinding gears of diplomacy, war, and dynastic intrigue, matters over which they now had zero control. They were a general with no army, a lord with no lands, a king with no subjects. They were a symbol, a name on a treaty, an object to be bargained over. This enforced passivity was a special kind of hell for men and women accustomed to lives of action and command. The loneliness of the political prisoner was not the raw isolation of the forgotten soul in the pit. It was the loneliness of the apex predator displayed in a menagerie. They were surrounded by the trappings of their station, but stripped of the power that gave it all meaning. The hours, days, and years bled into one another, marked only by the changing view from the window. Each new season was a bitter reminder of another year lost, another opportunity for glory or vengeance squandered in helpless inactivity. Furthermore, their value as a living pawn was the very thing that made their situation so perilous. The political calculus that kept them alive could change in an instant. A new rebellion by their allies on the outside, intended to secure their freedom, might instead seal their doom by convincing their captor that they were too dangerous to be kept alive. The death of a king, the rise of a new faction at court, or a sudden peace treaty could render them worthless as a bargaining chip, and thus disposable. This led to a state of constant gnawing paranoia. Every meal could be poisoned. Every new guard could be an assassin. The physicians sent to treat their ague could be there with a more permanent cure. The history of medieval power is written in the blood of imprisoned rivals. The mysterious fate of the princes in the Tower, the alleged murder of King Edward II with a red-hot poker at Berkeley Castle. These stories, whether entirely true or not, formed the mental landscape of every political captive. They had to be constantly vigilant, passing every word from their jailer, scrutinizing every gift, trusting no one. Their comfortable chamber was a stage, and they knew that at any moment the play could turn from a drama of confinement into a tragedy of assassination, with the curtain falling in sudden, silent violence. Finally, we come to the most tragic figure of the medieval dungeon, the individual who embodied its ultimate horror, the forgotten. This prisoner had no monetary value to a creditor, no political leverage for a king. They were a loose thread in the social fabric, and the system, instead of mending it, simply pulled it until it vanished. They were the administrative errors, the victims of a chaotic and often indifferent bureaucracy, the friendless souls who had, through a series of mundane misfortunes, fallen through the cracks and into oblivion. How does a person become forgotten? The process was terrifyingly simple. Imagine a man arrested on suspicion of poaching by the men of a local lord. The lord, the only one who knows the details of the case, is promptly summoned to war by the king and is killed in a skirmish in Flanders. The record of the arrest was purely verbal. The man sits in the castle's cellar and no one knows quite why he is there. Or consider a case where the written records, the precious scrolls of parchment kept in a damp castle archive, are damaged by mold or eaten by rats. The prisoner's name remains on a list of inmates, but the details of their charge are gone. A change in the ruling dynasty could mean that the prisoners of the old regime were of no interest or concern to the new one. They were simply part of the castle's inventory, like a rusty suit of armor. For the forgotten prisoner, the dungeon became their entire universe, their life's final chapter. The initial, frantic hope for a trial, for any kind of resolution, would fade over the first year. The second year, it would curdle into a dull, resentful despair. By the 5th, or the 10th, or the 20th year, all that remained was a formless, featureless endurance. They became a part of the dungeon's ecosystem. They would watch generations of other prisoners come and go, the debtors who were ransomed, the thieves who were hanged, the political prisoners who were released or murdered. They alone remained. The jailers who first locked them in grew old and were replaced by their sons. The lord of the castle died and was succeeded by an heir who had no idea of the human relic mouldering in his foundations. The prisoner's original crime, if one ever existed, was lost to the mists of time, forgotten by everyone, including, eventually, the prisoner themselves. The psychological state of such an individual is a descent into a void that is difficult to fully articulate. They inhabited a state of absolute and profound meaninglessness. Their immense suffering served no purpose. It was not coercing a payment. It was not leveraging a political advantage. It was not even a formal punishment. It was simply a fact, as elemental and indifferent as the stone that surrounded them. They were the living embodiment of the oubliette, the place of forgetting. Their own mind became a second dungeon. The battle was to hold on to the self. In the early years, they would desperately cling to memories, replaying their former life over and over. The face of their wife, the sound of their children's laughter, the layout of their village, the taste of fresh-baked bread. But memory needs reinforcement, and in the sensory-deprived vacuum of the cell, these precious images would begin to fray. After a decade, the faces would become blurry, the names harder to recall. After 2, they might struggle to remember their own surname. To stave off the encroaching madness, they might develop intricate rituals, counting the stones on one wall, tracing the patterns of mold, giving names to the spiders who shared their cell. Their world contracted to these 4 walls, and their identity began to dissolve into it. Socially, they were the lowest of the low, a pariah even among outcasts. A new prisoner, full of fear, but also of a narrative. I am here for this reason. I am waiting for that trial. Would look at the forgotten man in the corner, a skeletal, long-haired figure clad in rags, rocking and muttering to himself, and see their own potential future. The forgotten prisoner was a ghost who still breathed, a terrifying memento mori that served as a more potent warning than any threat from the jailer. They were a living testament to the system's capacity for absolute, careless, and total erasure. Their survival hung by the thinnest of threads, the sheer institutional habit of a jailer who was accustomed to dropping a loaf of bread at their cell door each day. They were no longer a person, they were a routine. The tales of the debtor, the political foe, and the forgotten are not merely categories of prisoners. They are illustrations of the different ways a human spirit can be besieged. Whether through the frantic anxiety of commerce, the high-stakes paranoia of power, or the slow, hollowing despair of absolute neglect, the long-term dungeon experience was a meticulous process of unmaking a person long before their body finally gave out. The stone walls of the medieval dungeon, which so effectively contained the prisoner, were no barrier at all to a host of other living things. These creatures were not accidental visitors, they were permanent residents, integral components of a complex and brutal ecosystem built entirely upon decay, neglect, and human misery. The prisoner, weakened and immobile, was not merely an observer of this world, they were its central resource, a source of heat, a source of food, and a habitat. To be imprisoned was to be unwillingly integrated into a food chain where one was distressingly close to the bottom. This constant, intimate, and often painful interaction with vermin was not a minor inconvenience. It was a major feature of the prisoner's daily and nightly torment, a relentless assault on their physical and psychological well-being, and a primary vector for the diseases that so often proved fatal. Let us begin with the smallest and most numerous of these unseen inmates, the insects. The prisoner's world was teeming with them. The straw that was thrown onto the floor, if it was provided at all, was the perfect breeding ground. It was rarely clean to begin with and was quickly soiled with spilled food, bodily waste, and dampness from the floor. This created an ideal environment for fleas. The prisoner's body, offering warmth and blood, became their hunting ground. The constant biting of fleas was a form of low-level, incessant torture. The itching was maddening, and scratching with dirty fingernails inevitably led to broken skin, which in the unsanitary conditions of the cell would quickly become infected, leading to painful sores and abscesses. A prisoner's legs and torso would often be covered in a mass of red, inflamed bites, a source of perpetual discomfort that made finding any kind of rest impossible. Even more intimate and persistent were the lice, specifically body lice, which live and lay their eggs in the seams of clothing. A prisoner would arrive in a single set of clothes, which they would wear without washing for the entire duration of their stay, months or even years. These garments would become stiff with filth and sweat, a perfect home for generations of lice. Unlike fleas, which jump on to feed and jump off again, lice lived on their host. The prisoner would feel them crawling in their hair, on their skin, a constant, tickling, unsettling sensation. They would spend countless hours in the dark, picking them off one by one, a futile and endless task. The psychological effect of being perpetually infested, of feeling one's own body has become a crawling colony, was profoundly debasing. It was a physical manifestation of their loss of dignity and control. More importantly, as we have touched upon, these lice were killers. They were the primary vector for epidemic typhus, the dreaded jail fever. A single louse, feeding on an infected prisoner, would ingest the Rickettsia bacteria. The bacteria would multiply within the louse and be excreted in its feces. When the louse moved to a new host and bit them, the irritated skin would compel the person to scratch. The scratching would rub the infected louse feces into the tiny wound, transmitting the disease. In the crowded, communal cells, where prisoners were chained in close proximity, sharing blankets if they had them, the spread was unstoppable. One infected prisoner brought in from the outside could trigger an epidemic that would sweep through the dungeon, killing a significant percentage of its population. The onset of jail fever was a death knell. The high fever, the splitting headache, the spotted rash, the delirium, these were the final stages of suffering for countless prisoners who might otherwise have survived their sentence or been found innocent. The tiny, almost invisible louse was, in reality, the most dangerous thing in the dungeon. Alongside the biting insects were the scavengers drawn by the scent of human waste and rotting food. Cockroaches and other beetles would scuttle across the floor in the darkness, a constant rustling presence. Spiders would spin their webs in the corners, the only creatures in the cell engaged in a productive architectural act. For a prisoner in solitary confinement, these creatures might, paradoxically, become a strange form of company. Stories exist of long-term prisoners who observed the habits of a spider for years, its daily routine becoming a focal point in their own meaningless existence. Its presence a small flicker of life in the deadening silence. But for most, they were just another element of the pervasive filth. Moving up the food chain, we encounter the most notorious and feared of the dungeon's inhabitants, the rat. The medieval castle and town were overrun with rats, primarily the black rat, Rattus rattus, and the dungeon was their kingdom. They were intelligent, adaptable, and bold. Drawn by the smell of the latrine bucket and the prisoners' meager rations, they were a constant and menacing presence. The prisoner would hear them in the walls, their scratching and squeaking a terrifying prelude to their appearance. They would scurry across the floor in the dark, and a prisoner sleeping on the floor might awaken to find a rat crawling across their chest. The daily ration of bread was a constant battleground. A prisoner could not simply set it aside to eat later. To do so was to invite the rats to share their meal. They would have to guard it jealously, perhaps holding it in their hands as they slept, or trying to find a high ledge to place it on, a difficult task in a bare stone cell. The rats were not merely thieves, they were aggressive. A weakened prisoner, unable to defend themselves, could be bitten. A prisoner who had died in the night would be food for the rats by morning. The historical and folkloric records are filled with gruesome tales of prisoners losing fingers, toes, or ears to rats as they slept in a feverish or drunken stupor. This was not mere fantasy, it was a grim reality for the most vulnerable. The rat was a symbol of the dungeon's predatory nature, a constant reminder that in this place, the weak were consumed. Furthermore, the rats brought their own ecosystem of disease with them. The fleas that lived on the rats were the carriers of another, even more famous, medieval plague, the bubonic plague. While a major plague outbreak like the Black Death of the 14th century was a society-wide catastrophe, smaller, more localized outbreaks were a constant threat. A dungeon, with its dense population of both rats and humans living in close proximity, was a perfect incubator for such a disease. The prisoner was trapped in a double jeopardy, susceptible to the lice-borne typhus from their fellow humans and the flea-borne plague from the rats. Beyond the vermin, the very substance of the dungeon itself was an ecological threat. The dampness was pervasive and inescapable. Water would seep through the stone walls from the surrounding earth or the castle moat, keeping the air perpetually cold and humid. The floor was often wet, and the straw bedding would quickly become a sodden, rotting mess. This constant exposure to damp and cold would work its way into the prisoner's bones, leading to agonizing rheumatic conditions, arthritis, and persistent, body-racking coughs. Respiratory illnesses, from the common cold to pneumonia, were rampant and, without any form of treatment, frequently fatal. A simple cough in the dungeon was a potentially life-threatening event. The mold and fungi that grew on the damp walls were another hazard. They covered the stone in a slimy, multicolored carpet of black, green, and white. The air was thick with their spores, which the prisoner breathed in constantly. While the precise dangers of black mold were not understood, it is certain that inhaling these spores day after day contributed to the respiratory distress so common among inmates. It also contaminated what little food they had. A crust of bread left on a ledge for a few hours could be covered in mold by the time the prisoner went to eat it. To a starving person, the choice was to eat the moldy bread or eat nothing at all. This entire ecology of filth was self-sustaining. The lack of sanitation was the root cause. The overflowing latrine buckets, the discarded food waste, and the general filth created the food source for the insects and rats. The insects and rats, in turn, carried the diseases that weakened the prisoners. A weakened prisoner was less able to maintain any semblance of hygiene, contributing further to the filth. A dead prisoner's body, if not removed promptly, became a major new resource for the scavengers, leading to a population boom among the rats and an increased risk of disease for the living. It was a vicious, closed loop of decay. The prisoners' senses were under constant siege from this ecosystem. The stench was overwhelming, a thick, gagging miasma composed of human excrement, rotting straw, stale sweat, mold, and the pungent, musky smell of the rat colony. This smell was inescapable. It clung to the prisoners' clothes, their hair, their skin. It was the very air they breathed. The sounds were a constant symphony of horror, the incessant whining of fleas, the rustle of cockroaches, the scratching and squealing of rats in the walls, the drip of water that never stopped, and the coughing and groaning of fellow prisoners in the grip of disease. Even the sense of touch was an ordeal. The sliminess of the walls, the crawling of insects on the skin, the damp chill of the floor, the coarse, biting texture of the lice-infested blanket. To survive in this environment required a radical recalibration of the self. The prisoner had to learn to sleep through the itching and the noise. They had to develop a sixth sense for the presence of rats, to become preternaturally still to avoid attracting attention. They had to overcome their revulsion to eat food that might have been touched by vermin. This process was dehumanizing. It reduced the prisoner to the level of an animal, concerned only with the most basic aspects of survival, finding a dry patch of floor, protecting their scrap of bread, warding off the things that sought to bite and feed on them. The psychological impact of living in such a state cannot be overstated. It was a constant physical reminder of their abject status. They were no longer a human being living in a society. They were a piece of meat in a cage, a host for parasites, a target for scavengers. The loss of physical cleanliness was deeply connected to the loss of spiritual and mental well-being. To be unable to wash, to be covered in filth and vermin, was to feel worthless, to feel that one had been cast out not just from human society, but from God's grace. The battle against the unseen inmates of the dungeon was a battle for one's own humanity. It was a battle waged every minute of every day, in the dark, against an enemy that was numberless, relentless, and utterly indifferent to the prisoner's suffering. And for so many, it was a battle they would ultimately lose, not to the executioner's axe, but to the bite of the smallest louse, or the quiet work of disease in a body too broken to fight back. In the relentless, multi-sensory assault of the medieval dungeon, where the body was systematically broken down by hunger, disease, and violence, the prisoner's last and only true sanctuary was the fortress of their own mind. It was here, in the immaterial realm of thought, memory, and belief, that the ultimate battle for survival was waged. The physical chains could bind the limbs and the stone walls could confine the body, but the captor's power was not absolute until they had also conquered this inner landscape. The psychological journey of a prisoner was a complex and deeply personal odyssey, one that could lead to extraordinary resilience, profound spiritual transformation, or a final, shattering descent into madness. The outcome depended on the individual's character, their past, their faith, and the specific nature of their confinement. Let us first consider the initial psychological shock, which we have touched upon, but which merits a deeper exploration. The moment the dungeon door closed, the prisoner was severed from everything that constituted their identity. A medieval person's sense of self was not the highly individualized, interiorized concept of the modern era. It was deeply woven into a tapestry of social relationships, obligations, and physical places. A man was a father, a son, a member of a guild, a parishioner of a specific church, a resident of a particular village or town. His identity was reflected back at him by the faces of his family, the respect of his neighbors, and the familiar landscape of his home. The dungeon violently ripped this tapestry to shreds. In an instant, the prisoner was none of these things. They were simply prisoner, an anonymous object in a stone box. This profound dislocation, this civil death, was the first and most powerful psychological blow. In the ensuing days and weeks, the prisoner's mind, starved of external stimuli, would begin to behave in strange and unpredictable ways. The sensory deprivation of a dark, silent cell was a form of torture in itself. The brain, hardwired to process information from the outside world, would begin to generate its own. This is the root of the hallucinations so commonly reported by those in solitary confinement. The prisoner might begin to hear voices, whispers of their accusers, comforting words from a long-dead mother, or the commands of God or the devil. They might see fleeting images in the oppressive darkness, faces in the texture of the stone, or ghostly figures moving in the periphery of their non-existent vision. At first, these experiences could be terrifying, signs of encroaching madness. For some, however, they might eventually become a form of company, a desperate population for their empty world. To combat this mental decay, prisoners would devise a vast array of strategies, a mental gymnastics routine to keep the mind exercised and sane. The most common was the obsessive use of memory. The prisoner would retreat into their past, reconstructing their life with painstaking detail. They would walk the streets of their hometown in their mind, naming every shop, every alleyway. They would recall the faces of everyone they had ever known. They would replay entire conversations, relive celebrations, and meticulously reconstruct the steps that led to their downfall. This was not mere nostalgia. It was a desperate act of identity preservation. By holding on to these memories, by keeping them polished and clear, the prisoner was fighting against the erasure that the dungeon sought to impose. They were reminding themselves that they were once someone, and clinging to the hope that they might be again. For the literate prisoner, this process could be more structured. They might compose poetry in their heads, committing hundreds of lines to memory. They might work through complex theological arguments or philosophical problems. The mind became a blackboard, a library, and a stage. Boethius, writing The Consolation of Philosophy while awaiting execution, is the archetypal example, but countless others, their names lost to history, engaged in similar intellectual labors. This was a way of imposing order on the chaos, of proving that even in the most degrading physical circumstances, the nobility of rational thought could not be extinguished. Another powerful survival mechanism was the focusing of the will onto a single, overriding purpose. This purpose could be a positive one, the burning desire to see one's family again. The image of a child's face could become a talisman, a sacred icon to be conjured in the darkest moments to provide the strength to endure another day. But often the driving force was negative, the all-consuming desire for revenge. The prisoner would spend their days and nights meticulously planning the vengeance they would enact upon their accusers, their captors, or the judge who condemned them. This hatred could become a powerful fuel, a fire in the gut that kept the cold of despair at bay. It gave their suffering a narrative and a future goal, transforming them from a passive victim into a protagonist biding their time. In the communal cells, the psychological dynamics were different. The horror of solitary sensory deprivation was replaced by the stress of constant, forced social interaction. The prisoner had to navigate a complex and violent micro-society, learning to read the shifting moods of their cellmates, to know who to trust, who to fear, and who to avoid. This required a state of constant, exhausting hypervigilance. Yet it also offered psychological resources unavailable to the solitary captive. The simple act of conversation, of sharing one's story and listening to another's, was a powerful affirmation of humanity. Even in the depths of misery, prisoners could form bonds of friendship and loyalty. They could share jokes, sing songs, and collectively curse their captors. This shared experience created a sense of solidarity that could be a powerful buffer against despair. It reminded them that they were not alone in their suffering, a small but vital comfort. For the vast majority of people in the medieval period, the most profound psychological resource of all was faith. Religion was not a private hobby or a weekly observance. It was the fundamental operating system of their reality, the lens through which every aspect of life was understood. The dungeon, therefore, was immediately interpreted within a religious framework. The prisoner's suffering was not meaningless. It was a test from God, a punishment for past sins, or a spiritual trial akin to that of the martyrs. This framework provided a powerful narrative for their suffering. A prisoner could see themselves as Job, tested by God despite their righteousness. They could see their confinement as a form of penance, a purgatory on earth that would cleanse their soul and guarantee their place in heaven. They could meditate on the passion of Christ, comparing their own physical pains, the chains, the hunger, the scourging, to those endured by the Saviour on the cross. This act of imitatio Christi, of consciously modelling one's suffering on that of Jesus, could elevate their squalid reality into a holy ordeal. The dungeon ceased to be a mere prison and became a spiritual crucible. Prayer was the primary tool of the faithful prisoner. It was a direct line to the ultimate power in the universe, a way of speaking when no human would listen. The recitation of the Psalms, the Pater Noster, and the Ave Maria became a daily ritual, a structuring device in the timeless void of the cell. These familiar, memorized words were a source of immense comfort, a connection to the community of believers outside the walls. The belief that saints and the Virgin Mary could intercede on their behalf provided a source of hope that was independent of the whims of their jailer or the machinations of the law. For some, the intense and unique conditions of the dungeon could lead to profound mystical experiences. Stripped of all worldly distractions, subjected to fasting and sensory deprivation, the prisoner was in a state remarkably similar to that of a hermit or an ascetic monk. This could induce altered states of consciousness, powerful visions, and a feeling of direct, ecstatic union with the divine. The prisoner might see angels in their cell or hear the voice of God speaking to them, offering comfort and promising salvation. These experiences, which might be diagnosed today as a product of psychological stress and malnutrition, were, for them, utterly real and transformative. They provided an unshakable conviction that their suffering had a divine purpose, making them impervious to the despair that consumed others. The story of Joan of Arc, who continued to hear the voices of her saints even in the depths of her captivity, is a famous example of this phenomenon. However, faith could also be a double-edged sword. If a prisoner's prayers went unanswered, if their suffering only deepened, their faith could begin to crack. They might fall into a state of profound spiritual crisis, believing that God had truly abandoned them. This was the sin of acedia, or sloth, which in its medieval conception was not mere laziness, but a deep spiritual despair, a weariness of the soul that led one to doubt God's goodness and mercy. For a pious person, this was a terror far greater than physical death, as it jeopardized their immortal soul. The silence of God could be more deafening than the silence of the cell, and for many, the fortress of the mind would ultimately be breached. The combination of physical decay, psychological stress, and endless monotony was simply too much to bear. The descent into madness could be a slow, gradual erosion of the self, or it could be a sudden, catastrophic break. The prisoner might retreat entirely into a catatonic state, becoming unresponsive, curled in a corner, refusing to eat or speak. Others might be consumed by a frantic, violent mania, screaming, beating against the door, and attacking anyone who came near. This madness was the dungeon's final victory. It stripped the prisoner of their reason, their memory, their very self. They became a hollowed-out shell, a ghost animating a human body. In the eyes of their captors, this was often seen not as a medical condition, but as a form of demonic possession, or a just punishment for their inherent wickedness. The mad prisoner was often treated with even greater brutality, chained more tightly, beaten more frequently, their incoherent ravings seen as proof of their guilt. The psychological journey through the dungeon was, therefore, a walk along a razor's edge. On one side lay the abyss of madness and despair. On the other, the high peaks of spiritual resilience and fortitude. The path was determined by the prisoner's inner resources. They fought back with memory, with logic, with hatred, and, above all, with faith. They sought to build an inner world so strong that the horrors of the outer world could not shatter it. Some succeeded, emerging from their ordeal with their spirit, if not their body, intact. Many others failed, their minds breaking under the intolerable pressure, their consciousness becoming the final, inescapable prison. The screams that echoed in the dungeon were not always from physical torture. Many were the sound of a mind consuming itself. For the medieval prisoner, life within the dungeon was a state of suspended animation, a grim purgatory between the world they had known and a future they could only dread. But for most, this period of waiting was finite. The day would eventually come when the slow, grinding wheels of the judicial system would turn to their case. The summons would arrive, not with a formal letter, but with the clank of a key and the gruff order of a jailer. The prisoner would be brought up from the depths, blinking and disoriented, into the light. This was the moment of transition from the private misery of the cell to the public theatre of the law. The final judgment was rarely a simple, dispassionate affair. It was a ritual, a social drama, and often a terrifying public spectacle designed to reaffirm the power of the authorities and the established social order. The journey from the cell to the courtroom was an ordeal in itself. The prisoner, having spent weeks, months, or even years in the darkness, would be acutely sensitive to the light. The ordinary daylight would feel like a physical blow, painfully sharp and blinding. Their legs, weakened by disuse and malnutrition, would tremble and threaten to buckle on the stone stairs. They would be a grotesque sight to the guards and any onlookers. Their hair and beard would be long, matted and crawling with vermin. Their body would be skeletal, covered in sores and filth. Their clothes, the same ones they were arrested in, would be tattered, foul-smelling rags. This shocking physical appearance was not an incidental detail. It was part of the process. The prisoner was already marked, visually condemned by the very effects of their confinement. They looked like a wretch, a creature from another world, making it easier for the judges and jury to see them as such. The nature of the court they faced depended entirely on their crime and their social status. For a commoner accused of a crime like theft or assault, the venue might be a manorial court held in the great hall of the local lord's castle, or a shire court presided over by the king's sheriff. For a merchant in a chartered town, it would be the burgher's court. For a high-ranking nobleman accused of treason, the court would be one of his peers, presided over by the king himself or his chief justice. And for a heretic, the tribunal would be an ecclesiastical one, conducted by bishops or inquisitors. Let us imagine a typical secular trial for a serious felony in the high or late Middle Ages, after the decline of trial by ordeal. The prisoner would be brought before a panel of judges. The concept of a defense lawyer as we know it did not exist for most of medieval history. The prisoner was expected to speak for themselves. They would be confronted with the evidence against them, which might include the testimony of witnesses or, most damningly, their own confession, extracted under torture and now presented as a voluntary statement. The prisoner who had been tortured was in an impossible position. To deny the confession would be to call the court's own methods into question and risk being tortured again. To affirm it was to seal their own doom. The introduction of the jury, particularly in the English common law tradition, was a significant development. However, a medieval jury was not the impartial body of strangers we expect today. The jurors were local men who were expected to have prior knowledge of the case, the accused, and the witnesses. They were, in a sense, a panel of community representatives, and their verdict often reflected local politics, prejudices, and fears as much as the evidence presented. A prisoner without friends or a good reputation in the community stood little chance. The sentencing, once a guilty verdict was delivered, was often swift and followed a set formula. The medieval penal system had a limited palette of options, but each was rich with symbolic meaning. For a host of lesser crimes, the sentence was a fine or a public humiliation. The stocks and the pillory were particular favorites. The prisoner would be locked by their ankles, wrists, or head into a wooden frame in the middle of the public market square. They would be forced to endure the jeers, insults, and projectiles of their neighbors for hours or days. The goal was shame, a social punishment that could be more devastating than a physical one in the close-knit communities of the time. The refuse thrown at them, rotten vegetables, mud, animal dung, was a physical manifestation of their social exclusion. For more serious crimes, the punishments were etched upon the body itself. Mutilation was a common sentence, a form of living justice. A perjurer might have their tongue pierced with a hot iron. A poacher might lose a hand, a visible and permanent reminder of their crime that also crippled their ability to earn a living. A counterfeiter who had debased the king's currency might have his hand cut off and nailed to the door of the mint, or be boiled alive in a cauldron, a horrific punishment that mirrored the cooking of the false coins. Branding with a hot iron, T for thief, F for felon, V for vagrant, marked the person as a permanent outcast. These punishments were not just about causing pain, they were about creating a living text of the law, a walking warning to others. The death penalty, however, was the ultimate expression of state power, and it was reserved for the most grievous offences: murder, treason, arson, and, in many places, grand larceny or repeated theft. The method of execution was carefully chosen to match the nature of the crime and the status of the condemned. A nobleman, as a privilege of his rank, was often granted the dignity of beheading by sword or axe. It was considered a swifter and more honourable death than the common alternative. For the common criminal, the standard method of execution was hanging. The condemned would be led from the courtroom, often with a priest walking alongside them, urging a final confession to save their soul. This was the death march, a public procession through the streets to the gallows, which were usually erected in a prominent place outside the town walls, such as a crossroads or a hilltop. This procession was a crucial part of the spectacle. It was a final opportunity for the community to witness the inexorable march of justice. The condemned might be jeered at, or, if they had popular sympathy, people might call out words of encouragement or offer them a final drink of ale. At the gallows, the spectacle reached its climax. A large crowd would have gathered, a mix of the morbidly curious, solemn citizens and festive opportunists selling food and drink. The executioner, often a feared and ostracized figure himself, would perform his duties. The condemned might be allowed to give a final speech from the scaffold. This was a charged moment. Some would confess their sins and warn others not to follow their path. Others would protest their innocence to the last. After the noose was placed, the condemned would be turned off the ladder, or the cart would be pulled from under them. The death was rarely instantaneous. It was a slow, agonizing process of strangulation, the body twitching and convulsing for several minutes in what was gruesomely termed the hangman's dance. After death, the body was often left hanging for days as a stark warning before being cut down and buried in an unconsecrated grave. For the crime of treason, the punishment was the most horrific of all: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This brutal ritual was reserved for those who had committed the ultimate crime against the body politic. The condemned would be tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse through the streets to the place of execution, a process that would tear their skin and flesh. There, they would be hanged, but cut down while still alive. They would be disemboweled, their entrails burned before their own eyes. Finally, they would be beheaded, and their body cut into 4 quarters. The head and quarters would then be parboiled and dipped in tar to preserve them, and displayed on spikes at prominent locations such as London Bridge or the gates of major cities. Every stage of this punishment was symbolic. The drawing represented their removal from society, the hanging their disgrace, the disemboweling the removal of their treacherous heart, and the quartering the dispersal of their memory. It was the ultimate act of state-sponsored terror, a complete and total annihilation of the individual. For the heretic, the sentence delivered by the church and carried out by the secular arm was burning at the stake. This punishment had its own terrible theological symbolism. Fire was seen as a purifying element, and by burning the heretic's body, the authorities were symbolically cleansing the community of their corruption and, in a twisted way, giving the heretic a final chance at salvation by enduring a taste of hell fire on earth. The burning was a slow and excruciatingly painful death, and the crowds who gathered to watch it did so with a mixture of pious fervor and morbid fascination. For the prisoner who was fortunate enough to be acquitted, the ordeal was not necessarily over. They might be released, but they would still be required to pay the jailer for their board during their time in prison. Many an acquitted prisoner found themselves returned to the very same cell, now imprisoned not for a crime, but for the debt they had incurred while waiting for their name to be cleared. The final judgment was the culmination of the dungeon experience. It was the point where the private suffering of the prisoner was transformed into a public lesson. The courtroom and the scaffold were stages, and the prisoner was the lead actor in a grim morality play. The pain, the shame, and the terror were not just byproducts of the punishment, they were its primary purpose. Through the public degradation, mutilation, and destruction of the condemned's body, the power of the Lord, the King, or the Church was made terrifyingly real, and the social and cosmic order which the crime had briefly disrupted was seen to be violently restored. For the prisoner, it was the final, agonizing act in a long tragedy that had begun the moment they were first accused. The iron doors of the last true medieval dungeons have long since rusted away. The straw on the floors has turned to dust, and the screams of the condemned have faded into the silence of centuries. Yet, the dungeon itself has not vanished. It has merely migrated from the physical foundations of castles to the deeper foundations of our collective imagination. It survives as a potent symbol, a powerful myth, and a persistent cultural echo that continues to shape our understanding of the past, our entertainment, and our ongoing debates about crime, punishment, and human rights. To conclude our journey, we must examine this afterlife to understand how the grim reality we have so carefully reconstructed has been transformed into the enduring legend we know today. The first part of the dungeon's legacy is physical and architectural. The great castles and fortresses that once dominated the European landscape, the Tower of London, the Conciergerie in Paris, the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, stand today as popular tourist attractions. Visitors walk the same stone corridors as the prisoners of old, peering into the dark cells, their experience mediated by guidebooks and museum plaques. These sites have become sanitized museums of suffering. The visceral reality, the stench, the filth, the pervasive cold, the constant terror is impossible to replicate. What remains is a kind of historical ghost train, a thrilling but ultimately safe encounter with a dark past. The tourist who shivers in an oubliette for a moment does so with the comforting knowledge that they will be ascending into the daylight in a few minutes to visit the gift shop. Nonetheless, this architectural preservation is crucial. It keeps a physical memory of the system alive, providing a tangible link to the suffering of past generations and serving as a physical anchor for the stories and myths that have grown up around these locations. The second, and perhaps most powerful legacy of the dungeon is found in our language. The vocabulary of medieval confinement has become deeply embedded in our everyday speech, often disconnected from its brutal origins. We speak of being in a dungeon of despair. We use the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered to describe a severe criticism. The word oubliette, from the French to forget, has entered the English language as the ultimate symbol of being discarded and abandoned. The phrase jail fever might be used metaphorically, its origins as a specific deadly disease forgotten. This linguistic residue acts as a constant low-level reminder of the dungeon's historical reality. These words are fossils of past suffering, carrying the weight of their origins even when we use them lightly. However, the most significant afterlife of the dungeon is in its transformation into myth. Beginning in the Renaissance and gaining momentum during the Enlightenment and the Gothic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, the medieval dungeon was repurposed as a powerful propaganda tool. For Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, who championed reason and decried religious fanaticism, the dungeon of the Inquisition became the ultimate symbol of the cruelty and superstition of the Dark Ages. It was portrayed as a place of arbitrary torture and priestly tyranny, a stark contrast to the new age of law and reason they believed they were inaugurating. The Gothic novel seized upon this imagery with lurid enthusiasm. Writers like Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and later Edgar Allan Poe in works like The Pit and the Pendulum took the historical reality of the dungeon and amplified it into a setting for supernatural horror and psychological terror. In these stories, the dungeon is a place of sublime dread, populated by sadistic monks, vengeful ghosts, and diabolical instruments of torture that often surpass the reality in their gruesome ingenuity. The historical prisoner, the starving debtor, the typhus-ridden thief, was replaced by the innocent maiden, the noble hero, and the nefarious villain. The complex social and legal reasons for imprisonment were stripped away, leaving a pure theatrical conflict between good and evil, innocence and corruption. It is this Gothic image, more than the historical reality, that forms the bedrock of the modern popular conception of the dungeon. This romanticized and horrifying image has proven incredibly durable. It is the direct ancestor of the dungeon in modern fantasy literature, film, and gaming. From the prisons of Mordor in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings to the sprawling, monster-filled labyrinths of the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, the archetype is the same. The fantasy dungeon is a place of adventure and challenge, a treasure-filled maze to be explored by brave heroes. The historical realities of disease, starvation, and legal injustice are replaced by combat encounters and magic puzzles. The prisoner is no longer a passive victim, but an active agent, the hero who must escape or the villain who must be defeated. This transformation from a place of static suffering to a place of dynamic action is perhaps the greatest departure from the historical truth. The dungeon's echo can also be seen in the very design of our modern prison systems. The reformers of the 18th and 19th centuries, such as John Howard in England, were horrified by the conditions of the old jails, the filth, the disease, the mixing of all types of prisoners. Their solution was the penitentiary, a new type of prison based on principles of order, discipline, and solitary confinement. The idea, inspired by Quaker beliefs, was that isolating a prisoner from corrupting influences would lead them to reflect on their sins, repent, and be reformed. The result was institutions like Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, with its radiating spokes of cell blocks where inmates were kept in near total silence and isolation. In a profound historical irony, these reformers, in their attempt to abolish the chaos of the medieval dungeon, created a new, scientific, and psychologically intense form of confinement that replicated the sensory deprivation and isolation of the oubliette on an industrial scale. The modern supermax prison, with its 23-hour-a-day lockdown, is the rational, technological descendant of the solitary stone cell. Finally, the legacy of the medieval dungeon continues to inform our contemporary debates on justice. The spectre of its horrors is often invoked by those arguing against capital punishment, torture, and cruel and unusual punishment. The memory of confessions extracted on the rack serves as a powerful argument for the importance of due process, the right to legal counsel, and the presumption of innocence. When we debate the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, we are, consciously or not, arguing in the shadow of the medieval torture chamber. The dungeon serves as a cultural baseline for cruelty, a historical benchmark against which we measure our own society's claim to be civilized and humane. It reminds us of the terrifying potential of unchecked state power and the capacity for cruelty that exists when legal safeguards are eroded. In a sense, our journey through the medieval dungeon has been a journey into a dark mirror. In its stones, we see not just the suffering of a distant past, but the reflections of our own enduring anxieties. The fear of being wrongly accused, of being helpless in the face of an implacable authority, of being forgotten by the world, of losing one's mind in isolation. These are not medieval fears, they are human fears. The dungeon concentrates them into a single, terrifying symbol. We have now spent a great deal of time in this bleak and desolate place. We have felt the cold, smelled the filth, and listened to the echoes of despair. We have seen how a person was arrested, how they lived, how they were questioned, how they were judged, and how they died. We have seen how their suffering was transformed into myth and how that myth continues to haunt us. The world of the medieval dungeon was a complex system of law, commerce, and belief, a system that created a unique and profound form of human misery. It was a place designed to break the body, the mind, and the spirit, and its ultimate legacy is to serve as a perpetual, solemn warning, a whisper from the past, reminding us of the fragility of justice, the value of compassion, and the darkness that can gather when one human being is given absolute power over another. I hope this exploration has been informative and perhaps, in its own quiet way, a source of calm reflection. Thank you for your time and your attention. May you have a peaceful and restful night.